In this video, we'll explore the fifth published string quartet of Felix Mendelssohn and the third of the Opus 44 set, published in 1838 when the composer was 29 years old. This exuberant E-flat major work shares both the key and the overarching mood of triumph with his celebrated string octet written 13 years earlier. But it is also a more mature work, exhibiting the craft of a composer who spent those 13 years refining his contrapuntal skills and honing his affective rhetoric. The overall shape of the four-movement work is this: an expansive sonata-form movement in E-flat major, a conspiratorial-sounding scherzo in C minor, an A-flat major love song in sonata form, and a finale that returns to the key and mood of the opening movement. In this recording, you'll hear the Melos Quartet in a release by Deutsche Grammophon. Movement 1 is one of the longest opening movements in Mendelssohn's entire chamber music catalog. Even without the indicated exposition repeat, which the Melos Quartet has chosen to omit, the movement comes in at a little over 9.5 minutes. The first theme begins immediately with a curling pickup figure in 16th notes. That little motive will soon permeate the proceedings, leaving its stamp on most of the themes. Those themes are worked out to impressive length, and most of them are both formally irregular and harmonically restless, tinged with dashes of chromaticism that suggest other keys. A notable case in point is the first member of the B-flat major second group, which begins in G minor. The development section is commensurate in length and explores a very wide range of affects. The recapitulation, on the other hand, is somewhat pared down, although its first theme area includes a fair amount of new material, somewhat in the spirit of the second development sections one often encounters in Beethoven during the transitional area of the recap. The multi-part coda revisits much of the thematic material before the music barrels ahead to a triumphant-sounding conclusion, an entirely appropriate resolution to all the chromatic and formal restlessness that leads to it. This may be music that could only have been written while the still young composer was on his honeymoon, which he was. Mendelssohn's scherzo style is celebrated. In fact, it is his scherzos that most often come to the minds of music lovers as being his most memorable musical utterances. No two of those scherzos are alike, however, and this one, a fast 6/8 time C minor essay, is both conspiratorial and occasionally eruptive in tone. The overall shape of the movement is familiar in its outlines, but in its particulars it departs somewhat from the Beethoven model. The trio, for instance, is in the same key as the scherzo submovement and includes both a couple of fugue expositions and a more expansive second theme. That second trio theme is brought back in juxtaposition with the scherzo theme, and the fugue exposition is further explored in a multi-part coda that finally devolves into a unison race to the conclusion, which evaporates in a skein of quiet pizzicati, the last gesture practically mimed. Movement 3 is set in the quartet's warm subdominant key and cast in the rubric of sonata form. It seems to be a love song filled with ardor and yearning, amply supplied with chromatic touches that turn the mind this way and that. The exposition includes a long transitional section that spends a fair amount of its time in E-flat minor. This transition will be omitted entirely during the recap, so it is useful to keep that E-flat minor music in mind for reasons that I will clarify shortly. The E-flat major second theme is a passionate outpouring that culminates in a first violin solo that falls through the octaves until it finds the peace it seeks. The movement's development section begins with a modal shift to the parallel minor and soon blossoms out into a distinctive hemiola passage that might be regarded as a third theme. I have so identified it in my running commentary. That new theme will play a substantial role in the movement's coda. I mentioned earlier that the transition, which included a great deal of E-flat minor music, is omitted during the recapitulation. It does, however, seem to be acknowledged in the most fleeting way imaginable, and that acknowledgement is easy to miss. It's a single C-flat, a note borrowed from both A-flat and E-flat minor, that appears in the first violin's melody line right near the end of the first theme's consequent phrase. If you're watching and listening for it, you'll catch it right before the second theme makes its A-flat major appearance. The explanation I've just given you is the only way I can account for the presence of this strange, anomalous, and rather head-turning borrowing. The coda is rich in affect and thematic substance, relying initially on a breathtaking transformation of the development's new theme, and the music comes to a reverent A-flat major close. The final movement returns us to both the key and the joyful, exuberant mood of the quartet's opening. Here, the energy is concentrated, focusing mainly on a four-note motive that first occurs just after the first page turn. Let me explain. The opening of Theme 1 isn't really its substance. It's obviously introductory in character. The substance of the theme really begins when the page is turned, and the aforementioned motive launches the movement's main project. That motive can be found in the first violin, 3 E-flat eighth notes followed by an athletic octave leap to a dotted quarter. This short, long rhythmic motive is, of course, often associated with Beethoven. Here it plays every bit as important a role as it does in the opening movement of the latter's Fifth Symphony, which is to say that the movement could almost be regarded as monothematic. Watch for that motive as the music proceeds and notice how rapidly the four members of the quartet toss it back and forth. In fact, that motive is so ubiquitous that the fixing of thematic beginnings is sometimes something of a judgment call. For instance, I have identified the beginning of the second group with a third unison statement of that motive, now expanded to the interval of a minor ninth in B-flat minor, harmonically off-center. The second group is, in fact, extraordinarily harmonically restless, and its most affecting passage is an 8-bar melody that I have identified as Theme 2C, by far the sweetest and probably most memorable melody in this movement. Pay careful attention to this theme. Its threefold presentation, distributed throughout the movement, is an important marker for the movement's harmonic progress back to the tonic. In this first appearance, it is in D-flat major, B-flat minor's mediant key. In fact, it does return to B-flat minor right at its close, laying the foundation for the exposition's closing in the quartet's dominant key. At this point, we encounter a formal mystery. This movement seems to represent a highly peculiar version of sonata rondo form, quite unlike any other I know. The exposition's closing seems to slip into a development section, which I have identified as such in my running commentary. However, that section is quite short and consists entirely of a prolongation of the dominant of E-flat major, and the first theme's recapitulation is furnished with a prominent countermelody and remains in force for a mere 8 measures before launching into a second development section, this one much longer and far more worthy of the name. This means that it is possible to read that first development section as a bridge to the real thing, which would then begin with the apparent exposition repeat that normally launches the development sections in sonata rondo form. I will leave it to you to wrestle with that or not as you please. At any rate, the real substantial recapitulation presents the themes in reverse order, beginning with the second group set in C minor. If the exposition's course were followed analogously, this would lead to the presentation of that beautiful theme 2C in E-flat major, which is what we would expect of such a theme during its recapitulation. However, the phrase that leads to it overshoots its goal, leading to a second presentation of this memorable theme in B-flat major. There is no clearer way for a composer to say, "We're not done yet." The retransitional bridge that follows brings us to the return of the second statement of Theme 1, the first statement having been furnished a few minutes earlier as a curiously abbreviated recap, again furnished with a countermelody. This time, the second part of the theme is worked out very fully, instead of shading off into a modulating transition as it had during the exposition, and this leads logically to a return of Theme 2A, now set in the quartet's home key and firmly established on harmonic center. The coda that this return sets up begins in the most magical way imaginable, with a return of the movement's most beautiful melody, finally sounded in E-flat major. But even then, Mendelssohn has a few more cards up his sleeve. That melody heads into the subdominant to set up the second part of the coda, wherein three of the musicians paint a broad homophonic landscape as the first violin scurries above it with a fiddle tune of high virtuosity. In a final gesture not unrelated to that of the C minor scherzo movement, the four players agree on a unison charge to a conclusion so thrilling it almost levitates me involuntarily every time I hear it.